cutting cell phone and wireless plan rates by 25%, putting a cap on how much telecom companies can charge you, reliable, high-speed internet for all. Those were some of the promises we heard during the last federal election campaign. Now, with a big report just out and a new phase of hearings underway, is there any real hope for action on this file? Let's find out from Jesse Hirsh. He's a longtime technology and internet watcher and president of the new media consulting firm MetaViews Media Management. It's good to have you in that chair again, Jesse.
Thanks, Steve.
Okay, cell phone prices are not usually the decisive issue at any election campaign, but the major parties were very focused on it last time. How come?
I think it's something that Canadians are really upset about, and I think it's something politicians can actually take action on. It's one of those problems that is really quite easy to solve and could be quite popular because I think a lot of people are fed up with the amount of money they spend a month, not just on their cell phone, but on their internet in general, right? So your TV, internet, cell phone, and for some people even landlines. And I think there is a real opportunity to get a win for Canadians.
I hear all the time that we have among the highest rates in the world for all of this, but I haven't seen the empirically provable evidence. Is that in fact true?
It is. The OECD has a bunch of studies that show that Canada does rank near the bottom when it comes to both competitiveness and affordability. Partly because of geography. Canada is unique both in terms of the vast geographic wilderness and the kind of ribbon population effect that does make it difficult for Canadian telecom companies to provide that service. But it's all just politics. Telecom is highly regulated everywhere around the world, and it's government policies that effectively set the prices that people pay, and in this regard, Canadian governments have been kind of complacent.
How about the quality of the connectivity that we have here in Ontario? What would you say?
It depends where you live in Ontario. Certainly in major urban centers, it's great connectivity, but you get outside of those urban centers and it is kind of scandalous.
Actually, we got the map here. Should we bring this up? Okay, I'm going to describe this for people listening on podcast. We've basically got 3 maps of the province of Ontario. And there is obviously a lot of connectivity and full service in places like Toronto and Ottawa, but then the further north you go, the map gets pretty empty.
Well, and part of it has to do with infrastructure. I mean, where there's highways, there's going to be connectivity. Where there's railway lines, there's going to be connectivity. But there are a lot of people in Ontario who even live close to major urban centers. For example, I live in Lanark County near a community called Clayton, Ontario. And Clayton, Ontario is on those maps as being covered, but it's actually not. And it's because of the geography of the Canadian Shield that it's in a kind of a valley, so the towers that are set up just don't reach it. So people don't get cell phone access, they get very poor internet access, and at the corner near my house, a place called Union Hall, people park on their way home to send their emails and make their calls, because once they go home, they're basically offline.
How can you be a tech expert and a tech giant and be like the savviest guy I know on this file and live somewhere where you can't get good access to internet?
Well, look, the future is rural, and you better believe I am bringing internet access to that community. It's just a matter of how, because that's the real challenge, is to ensure that all of Ontario has equal access to the digital services we depend upon.
How far are you from Ottawa?
I'm about a 45-minute drive.
Now, see, like to me, that's amazing. You're only 45 minutes from Ottawa, which is, of course, one of the tech hubs of this country, one of the great tech hubs, and you're getting spotty service.
Well, and this is the scandal, that it's really easy to actually provide this service. It just may not be profitable to the larger companies. And that's the problem, that we're leaving it to the free market when historically it's actually been municipalities. It's actually been governments that have done the most to enable this infrastructure. And yet we have this myth that it's only going to be the free market that provides.
Well, maybe this is a good spot for a little history lesson. Can you take us back to the time when we actually first got wireless in this country and basically how it happened?
Well, wireless was really an extension of the wireline infrastructure, and the history of Canadian telecommunications is the history of the railways, right? Traditionally, our telecom infrastructure was partly owned by CN and CP originally, because all that connections were run on railway lines. So when we started to create wireless infrastructure, yes, it started in major urban centers, but it also followed that same infrastructure, because a wireless tower still needs an uplink. It still needs something to connect to. Now, on an industrial level, first it was microwaves. So even before there was cell phone access, there were microwave towers that people would probably recognize from driving on the highway but not know what they were. But cell phone towers also picked upon that infrastructure. So it's therefore the places that were most populous, the places that were most profitable. And the more remote communities, we're only now starting to install some of the wireless infrastructure. And even then, it's not necessarily sufficient for people's needs.
And let's again focus on Ontario. Who built all the infrastructure that's in place now?
Well, largely it started with Bell and Rogers as the two main, Rogers being the former cable monopoly, Bell being the former telecom monopoly. And there were some initial efforts to try to do other types of wireless infrastructure. For example, in Thunder Bay, the entire telecom infrastructure is owned by the city of Thunder Bay.
Yeah, what is it, TB-Tel?
TB-Tel, yeah. Because no private company is going to wire up or set up wireless in northwestern Ontario.
Too remote?
Too remote, not profitable, not populous enough, but essential for mining, essential for forestry, essential for industry. So it was the municipality who said, we need to invest in this. We'll set up the wireless towers. We'll set up the wireless connectivity. And, even in southern Ontario, southeastern Ontario, there's Westport, WTC. And so that's out of Westport, Ontario, where again, it wasn't profitable. There's a lot of lakes, there's a lot of rough, Canadian Shield-like geography. So they had to set up their own service and set up their own basically local networks. So while Rogers and Bell built a lot of the infrastructure, there are a lot of independent players who've also created both landline and wireless infrastructure.
Westport being just a little bit north of Kingston. Are you saying that people's property taxes essentially went to building all that infrastructure?
In various different circumstances, yes. And the question is how public money paid for it. When it comes to Bell and Rogers, there's a lot of public access. There's a lot of subsidies. There's a lot of incentive. But when it comes to remote communities, it's often literally the municipality. Or in Muskoka, it's often regional municipalities that are investing in this type of infrastructure. Heck, even in southern Ontario, York Region is running their own fiber optic service because they're dissatisfied with the major telecom providers, and they want to make sure that their diverse municipality, collection of municipalities, has the connectivity that they need.
Interesting. Ontario is, of course, a huge province, but Saskatchewan's a pretty big province as well. How do our rates compare?
Saskatchewan has actually some of the most affordable telecom rates in the country.
Now, why would there be such a difference?
It's because of SaskTel. Because the provincial telecom infrastructure in Saskatchewan is largely owned by the Saskatchewan government, which is kind of the history of the prairies. I mean, it's from Thunder Bay west that the entire telecom infrastructure, with the exception of the railways, was created by the provinces. Because whether it was Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta, BC, no one was going to do it except for the most profitable areas. So it was the governments that originally owned the telecom infrastructure. Now, TELUS is actually a byproduct of what used to be Alberta Government Telephone and BC Tel. And MBTel used to be owned by the Manitoba government. It ended up being bought by Bell, but all of that was public infrastructure that was paid for by taxpayers because no one else was going to do it. And it's ironic that Saskatchewan is kind of the only remaining provincially owned telecom infrastructure. And as a result, residents of Saskatchewan get far better prices and service.
Now, if you're a new entrant into this business, is there a difference in the way you will be treated by, say, a government-owned or a municipally-owned telecom system as opposed to a Rogers or Bell or TELUS?
It depends, because again, it's all geographic. It depends where you are. Now, there are actually wireless startups or wireless providers who are establishing their own towers, creating their own equipment, creating their own infrastructure, but they're doing it in very specific, either rural or industry-specific applications. So there are people creating that. But the question is access to infrastructure, access to hydro poles to put antennas, access to property to put up towers, and then the uplink itself, how you're connecting to the rest of the network. That's where the incumbents have a huge advantage. And that's where we need to have better public policies to make it easier either for new competition or for more transparency, so we understand where the incumbents are getting their costs from, and as a result, why they're charging what they are.
Okay, but let me ask the question that I suspect Bell and Rogers want me to ask right now, which is, if they built all this infrastructure to begin with, why should later players to the game get, I wouldn't say a free ride, obviously, but an easier ride than they would want?
I think the primary argument is whether we're discussing public infrastructure or private infrastructure. And I think there's a very strong argument as to why this should be considered public infrastructure. And if you look at Rogers and Bell as two examples, they're vertically integrated monopolies. They own
Which means what?
It means that they own the entire chain of production. So they own the infrastructure, they own the service delivery, and increasingly they also own the media companies that are delivering content over those networks. So what if you broke that up? What if you said infrastructure, that's public. That's a good, like water, like roads, that everyone should have access to. And then on top of that, companies can deliver services, whoever gives the best cell phone access, the best internet access. And then separate from that, you have content, right? The movies and TV shows and apps that you go through. By having them all vertically integrated into a single company, that's where the notion of a public good versus a private benefit gets really cloudy. And that's where it's hard for people to see, well, it's actually not Bell who built that infrastructure. It's us, the clients of Bell, who paid Bell for services. We're the ones who built that infrastructure by paying for those monthly services. So shouldn't we have some right to this water or roads or necessary infrastructure that all of us depend upon?
So you're saying government should expropriate that infrastructure?
No, I'm saying government should regulate that infrastructure the way it's always been regulated. I mean, back when it was copper line, people in urban centers paid a little bit more per month so that rural customers didn't have to pay the actual cost of delivering rural services. We've always had subsidies, we've always had regulation. The question is, what regulation are we going to have to ensure that the public interest is met?
Okay, let's do another example of, say, a late entrant into the marketplace. You say Rogers and Bell essentially built the infrastructure. Several years ago, this group called Freedom Mobile comes along and they want in. How did that all work itself out?
Well, again, that was government policy. The Harper government wanted to increase competition in the telecom market. And so when they had a wireless spectrum, which is basically selling rights to use the electromagnetic spectrum to allow for this connectivity, the Harper government prioritized new entrants. And they said, we're going to make sure that new entrants have a slanted scale when it comes to buying and bidding on these auctions so that we can have new players enter the market. And while it was effective at enabling those new entrants, there wasn't enough support for those new entrants to actually survive. They ended up just being food for the larger incumbents to kind of buy and eat up. But the point is, it was public policy. It was public policy that said we want more competition, we want new entrants. And I think the Trudeau government is coming to a similar conclusion that whether it's through wireless spectrum auctions or just mandating access to existing networks, that more competition would fundamentally be better for Canadians.
Okay, but has anything fundamentally changed in the way that those companies can operate once they're in to enable them to thrive?
Economically, no. Technically, yes. And on a technical level, it's actually easy for those companies, new companies, to be what's called an MVNO, a mobile virtual network operator, which means that they use the existing infrastructure, but then provide their own services on top, which could not only be cheaper for Canadians, but actually enable a far more competitive landscape. And there still will be a need for infrastructure, and some of these companies may invest in infrastructure, especially in underserved areas, but it also acknowledges that the network is kind of public, and therefore everyone should have access to it. So on a technical level, it enables competition in a way that was not previously possible. Economically, will these companies be able to earn Canadians' trust and find a customer base? Only the market can really determine that.
Now, I think it's still the case in this country that if you want to own a TV station, you got to be Canadian. What about in this sector here? Are foreigners allowed in?
Not presently, and that has been a very contentious issue because a lot of people have said the easiest way to introduce competition is to raise foreign ownership limits. And I mean, originally, you have to remember, Bell Canada used to be owned by AT&T, right? The American monopoly. It was only in the 70s that Bell Canada became fully Canadian. So it's only really recently that we've had full domestic control over our telecommunications, and there's a lot of people who say that's not necessary, that we should invite AT&T, we should invite Verizon, we should invite Deutsche Telekom, and that's where it's not just them, it's Google and Facebook, who all of a sudden might start to provide internet access, and a lot of people feel that that would create a very competitive market and lower prices for Canadians.
Do you have a view on that?
I think it depends on the regulation. I think the danger of opening foreign ownership limits is it just means that Bell will once again be owned by AT&T and Rogers will be bought out by Comcast. And fundamentally, that's not good for the Canadian economy. But I think if you did it right, you could allow for foreign competition and allow for domestic companies to be on a level playing field that actually would benefit Canadians.
You told us earlier that the government of Saskatchewan basically owns SaskTel, got it going. Are we too far down the road in the province of Ontario, for example, to have a similar institution here?
Not at all, because there are areas, especially in rural Ontario, where the market is not fulfilling those needs, that I think there's a role, maybe not for the province, but for municipalities. As a creature of the province, but as more close to those communities and more able to help them. I mean, I've been writing a series about small ISPs in Ontario and the low costs that they have, the efficiencies they've found, farmers who are literally running fiber optic from farm to farm to farm as a way to increase their connectivity. So it's happening out there, but they kind of need municipal support. Like, for example, the setup cost, the installation cost in smaller municipalities is always much higher. So if municipalities would subsidize that, make it easy for smaller ISPs to dig on the side of roads or to run cables on hydro poles, or if the province, for example, mandated that Ontario Hydro should provide access to their poles, their own infrastructure to run fiber optic lines and wireless connectivity, that would be a tremendous advantage for Ontario communities to wire themselves up and for municipalities to wire themselves up, both with wireless and with fiber. So it's small little policies like that that could go a long way to improving our public infrastructure.
And those municipal institutions, could they be profitable?
It depends. And they could be profitable in the sense that they could actually generate revenue. But I think it's more appropriate to think about them as essential services, in that you don't need to profit from the water service. You don't need to profit from the sewage system.
It's got to cover your costs.
You need to do cost recovery, but it's also economic development. Right? If small and rural communities invest in internet infrastructure, they're enabling small businesses. They're enabling professionals like me who move from Toronto to Lanark County to find a way to still do what they do and live in a more humane and a more connected community. So I actually think the payoff is not on the monthly fees, it's on the businesses and economic development that flows as a result.
I do hear that quite frequently, actually, in my travels around the province, is that, people say, unless we want everybody living in Toronto and Ottawa, we've got to somehow incentivize people to leave the bigger centers, and one easy way to do it is to make sure that everybody has the same level of connectivity wherever you live.
Well, and this was a big issue at ROMA, the Rural Ontario Municipalities Association conference that happened about a month ago. Because when you get outside of Toronto and Ottawa and Kitchener-Waterloo, this is the number one issue, right? Connectivity, because it is tied to economic development. And I actually think that there are a lot of people who want to leave Toronto for reasons of rent and mortgage and can find a real quality of life in smaller communities if the internet infrastructure is there.
Indeed. Okay, last couple of minutes here, let's touch on the CRTC, the Canadian, worst name of any institution, Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, the regulator in other words. They've got hearings underway right now on all of this. What's going on?
It's really about what the right balance is between encouraging investment in infrastructure and enabling competition. I mean, the biggest issue is this mobile virtual network operator idea, whether people can use the existing incumbents' infrastructure. But it's also about what the prices should be and what the communication should be. Like, for example, I think most Canadians feel as if they're being deceived from their telecom providers, right? They have a conversation on the phone about what the price should be, what the speeds should be, and then the bill shows up and they're shocked. Like, how come I'm paying this? And how come I'm not getting the speeds that they promised? So I think there's little things, like, for example, getting a service report every month from your provider that tells them what speeds they actually were able to deliver, right? That tells you, how it lines up to the promises they made you originally.
Does anybody do this?
No, not presently.
But you think maybe the government should urge them to?
Yeah, it would be an easy mandate. More transparency to the telecom market. More, when you negotiate a deal on the phone, have them send you a contract that literally tells you what you just agreed to, so you clear up some of these obfuscations or uncertainties when it comes to those pricing. So this is really the CRTC trying to figure out how can it ensure that it's a healthy industry, but also that consumers are protected. Because in a minority government, this is going to be an issue, because both the Liberals, NDP, and the Conservatives have all been very clear. They want Canadians paying less money per month, and they want competition. So now it's up to the CRTC to figure out how that's going to play out.
Well, but around election time, this does seem to be an issue that, well, as we saw in the last election, it kind of bubbles up to the surface and there's a lot of talk about it. And then once the election is passed, and particularly, not this time, but particularly if there's a majority government, the thing may recede from public eye because other things take over. How do you think you hold their feet to the fire this time?
I actually think it's an easy win. I think especially given that we could have another federal election any time, it's an easy thing for politicians to say, hey, look what we did. The question is whether they have the courage to stand up to the telecom oligopoly. And that's where, historically politicians have not, right?
Why not? Back in the day, it used to be, well, we don't want to, I was about to say a bad word, we don't want to tick them off because they contribute money to our campaigns, but there's such limits on contributions right now. These guys can't give that much anyway.
Yes, but the telecom industry now owns the media. They literally own the newspapers and the television stations and the radio stations. So I think there is a little bit of fear of not making an enemy of the 800-pound gorilla in the room. And I think that's why it's been punted to the CRTC. Because as a regulator, it's easier for them to come up with these recommendations and allow the politicians to seem as if they're a little distant. But I am cautiously optimistic that this particular issue is going to be pursued, maybe not effectively, but nonetheless in a way that allows politicians to say, hey, look, we're doing something.
Do you think it's advisable for governments to intervene in the marketplace to such an extent as to require companies to charge less? Can they force them to charge less?
I think what they could do is force them to be honest about their costs. I think if the actual cost of the service delivery and the infrastructure was transparent and we realized how much we were being gouged, then I think there would be a little political pressure to say, hey, stop them from manipulating us, stop them from ripping us off, let's have an honest price. Because telecom should be regulated. It is a public good. And look, Bernie Sanders in the United States, one of his major policies is free fiber to the home to all Americans, right?
Paid for by whom?
Paid for by municipalities, paid for by taxpayers. Jeremy Corbyn, unsuccessfully, also had a similar pledge in which he was going to nationalize British Telecom and have free fiber to the home to every British resident. Again, radical, but it speaks to the way the policy debate is shifting towards those types of extreme tactics. So if Canada took a compromise and just had greater transparency and greater consumer protection, at least we're not nationalizing Bell and Rogers, but nonetheless would actually deliver Canadians a meaningful impact when it comes to their monthly bills.
Can I ask you a ridiculous little question here at the end? I got a little place up on Manitoulin Island. And, you want to talk about connectivity issues? I often hear people up there talk about, how good's your connectivity? And they say it depends which way the wind is blowing. Yeah. Now, is that a real thing or are they just being funny?
They're being facetious, but yes, weather has a huge impact on wireless. Storms, snow, different ways that break up the waves. Again, it depends on the connectivity itself, but this is why we need greater infrastructure. And look, the next step after this is satellite. Right? We're about to see a whole new, what's called low Earth orbit satellites that, especially for Manitoulin Island, could provide tremendously better connectivity. But the question is, what are the policies? How do we decide how that's divvied up? And unfortunately, it's geography and weather that does have an impact on our internet connectivity. So as Canadians, we should be prepared to not so much pay a little more, but ensure that taxes and ensure that our public infrastructure helps mitigate the reality of living in the Canadian wilderness.
Jesse, I learned a new acronym today. MVNO?
Yes.
What does that stand for again?
Mobile Virtual Network Operator.
Awesome. You guys in tech. All right. That's Jesse Hirsh. He's the president and CEO of MetaViews Media Management Limited. We thank you for coming into TVO tonight.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.